we are now at the penultimate week of the MLS season, and that this is going to be the last match week that we're going to have before decision date. That's going to be happening next week. And for this week, MLS did something very interesting where they're not going to have any interleague games, and that there's going to be two different kickoff time slot for all 12 of these games, and that for the Eastern Conference matchup, it's going to be kickoff at 5 p.m. Eastern Time and 2 p.m. Pacific Time, while for the Western Conference matchup, it's going to be kicking off at 7:30 Eastern Time and 4:30 Pacific Time. And that, because of that, I decided to kind of just split the preview into two parts again, and where in this video, I'll talk about the Eastern Conference kind of matchup, and that tomorrow I will be talking about the Western Conference matchup. And that coming into this week, we still have 4 spots that is still yet to be clinched in terms of the playoffs. There's going to be 1 that is coming from the Eastern Conference, and there's going to be 3 that's coming on the Western Conference. Although for the Eastern Conference, from what I know, is that 1 spot left for the playoffs could be clinched this week, and most likely could clinch this week, depending on that last team, or the team that is currently right above the red line could actually get a draw or a win in that game. But we first start off with one team that is below the red line right now, which is the Chicago Fire. So they, of course, are playing against Toronto FC, who already clinched their playoffs. Chicago is 9-11-12, while TFC is 12-10-10. In terms of playoff implication, obviously for Chicago, they are fighting for their playoff life, and that they really need to win this game, because if they lose this game, they will be eliminated from the playoffs. And that if New England does win their game against NYCFC, they will also be eliminated from their playoff spot. So this is a must-win for Chicago in this game, although they're playing against a TFC team that, while they have officially clinched their spots in the playoffs, they are certainly want to get that last spot in the playoffs, where you're going to have a home game in the first round of the playoffs, and that they're 2 points behind DC for that last spot, which is 4th place, and that DC obviously are playing against the Red Bulls, which that could also be a matchup that could really decide who exactly is going to get that last spot of hosting a home games in the knockout round. But certainly for TFC, they're hoping that either the Red Bulls or DC does draw their game, so that if they do win this game, they gain 2 points on them, and that basically the 4th spot is now all tie heading into the final day. But as I said before, for the Chicago Fire, they need to win this game, and it's not going to be easy when you're facing against a TFC team that still have yet to lose a single game since the turn of August, and that this team has definitely looked to be a very kind of dangerous team heading into the playoffs. And that I think maybe the only thing that I'm still a little bit concerned about TFC in terms of their chances of going deep is that you've seen in some of these big games where they had a chance to get all 3 points in the game, and that in the late moment of the game they weren't able to close it out, and they weren't able to kind of finish the job and get all 3 points in the game. So that's something I'm a little bit concerned, because in the playoffs, there's nowhere, if you draw against a team in the playoffs, you don't just end it in a draw. And that pretty much throughout the playoffs, if the game ends in a tie, you have to go to extra time. And knowing TFC has kind of faltered many times this season down the stretch and unable to get those wins because of that moment, that makes me a little bit worried about this team. But moving on into the next match is another team that is definitely up for elimination, although unlike for Chicago, where I still think that they legitimately have a chance depending on if New England does win their game, and that if they of course win the game against TFC, it could really come down to the final day in terms of that last spot in the playoffs in the Eastern Conference. For Orlando City, not so much, because while they technically are still alive in terms of the playoffs, they will be eliminated if they lose or tie against FC Cincinnati, or New England win or tie against NYCFC, and that it will literally be a miracle if they are actually going to make it to the playoffs. Now, the good news is they're playing against FC Cincinnati, which is a team that, I'm not going to say that it's a free win for teams that face against Cincinnati, because knowing how Cincinnati has been in the last couple of weeks, they have definitely played that spoiler role like it's something that they could win a war on. So yeah, I mean, I think Orlando's got to be careful about this, and obviously they need to win this game, because if they lose or tie this game, they'll be officially eliminated from the playoffs. But at the same time, they also, besides the fact that they need to win this game, they need to make sure they don't want to lose their focus on that New England game, where I'm pretty sure throughout the game there's going to be at least somebody that is going to be checking on the New England resort, and that, if they of course win their game and New England does win their game also, they of course will be eliminated from the playoffs. But if they of course win this game and New England lost that game against NYCFC, then yeah, it can really come down to the final day where there's going to be three teams fighting for that last spot in the Eastern Conference. And oh, by the way, these two teams that is below the red line, Chicago and Orlando City, that is fighting for that last spot and trying to steal away from New England, yeah, they're playing each other on decision day. And as I mentioned, that could really be a match that can maybe decide who exactly is going to make the playoffs and who exactly is going to be eliminated from the playoffs. Next up, Columbus. So Columbus is playing against the Union. Columbus is currently 9-8-15, and they're eliminated from the playoffs. While the Union is currently 16-7-9, and they're currently 6 points behind NYCFC and 1 point ahead of Atlanta in that third spot. It's highly unlikely that they're going to catch NYCFC for that top spot, even though they're technically still alive, because NYCFC, all they need is a draw against New England, and that Philly make sure that they have to win their game against Columbus to keep their hopes alive of getting that top spot. But overall, I think the main worry for Philly is trying to secure that second place, because although they're not going to get the first position in the Eastern Conference, which give them a bye for the first round, at least one thing that is the reason why they should make sure they secure that second spot is that if they do move on from the first round of the playoffs, they will once again have home field advantage in the second round of the playoffs, and that if they fall through third place, and depending on how the lower seed does, and maybe the lower seed can put a little bit of a shock against those teams that is currently in the top part of the table, they're not going to have a home playoff game for the second round if they find themselves in third place of the Eastern Conference. So it's very important that they want to secure second place right now, and that they are once again going to be on the road against a Columbus team that certainly is one of those teams that like to spoil teams' chances, and that this is a Columbus team that, even though they've been eliminated from the playoffs, it didn't feel like they're eliminated, and that they just keep going like if they are still have some playoff contention that they are fighting for in these last couple of weeks. Speaking of Atlanta, they of course play against the Montreal Impact, who is currently 11-4-17, and Atlanta is currently 17-13-12. For Montreal, obviously they are eliminated from playoff contention, which I don't think they really mind, because they won the Canadian Championship, which, not only is a trophy for them, but now they're going to be going back to the CONCACAF Champions League. And as I said before, I think for the last couple of weeks, Montreal was really focusing on this Canadian Championship, and that, they would be willing to sacrifice their playoff hope in order to win the Canadian Championship. And, it's good that it worked out at the end where, yes, they are eliminated from the playoffs, but they kind of sacrificed that so that they of course can win another trophy and get themselves in the CONCACAF Champions League. Now, that being said, despite the fact that they're eliminated from the playoffs, they still have a chance to potentially play spoiler against an Atlanta team that is only 1 point behind Philly for that second spot. And as I mentioned about Philly, Atlanta definitely want to have that second spot, so that in case if the second round is going to be a matchup between Philly and Atlanta, and it's going to be a 2v3 kind of scene matchup, then if Philly does finish second place, they will have home field advantage against Atlanta. And that, Atlanta, certainly they really want to at least have home field advantage for the first 2 rounds of the playoffs, because on the road, they have been absolutely terrible this season. Although, this is going to be another game that they're not going to have Joseph Martinez, and that, this game will really kind of tells whether or not if Atlanta can really be a team that can get a win, even though they won't have Joseph Martinez in their starting 11. I mean, as I mentioned, he's going to be out for a couple of weeks when I talk about that in the news of the week, and that they're probably going to at least be missing Joseph Martinez for that first round of the playoffs, and that, Montreal, although they're not really kind of a playoff team, and that it's going to be much tougher for them once they head to the playoffs, where they have to face against a team that trying to maybe create an upset against Atlanta on the road. It's going to be interesting to see that if they do win this resort, then maybe I give them a little bit faith on the fact that they can, of course, win a playoff game without Joseph Martinez. And the other reason why I kind of feel like I don't really have a lot of faith in terms of Atlanta going deep into the playoffs is the fact that they don't have Joseph Martinez, and that you saw in the last game where when they did not have Joseph Martinez, they got absolutely blown out of the window by NYCFC. And that, to be fair, they were on the road against the best team in the Eastern Conference, so maybe I'll give them a pass in terms of that. But I would definitely not give them a pass of the fact that they will lose this game against a Montreal team that pretty much have nothing else to fight for, and that if Atlanta does lose this, if I'm an Atlanta fan and see this team lose to Montreal, I better be very concerned about the fact that they could actually have an early exit in the first round of the playoffs. But moving on, and speaking of NYCFC, they are playing against New England Revolution, who is currently 10-12-10, while NYCFC is currently 17-10-5. Playoff implication in this game, New England, obviously, they will clinch their playoff spot with a win against NYCFC, which hence, that's why earlier in this video, I said that most likely the Eastern Conference, as we head into decision day next week, there probably won't be any kind of playoff implication in terms of team fighting for that last spot of the playoffs heading into decision day, because if New England can win this game against NYCFC, they of course will be clinched their playoffs, and depending on if Chicago does lose their game against TFC, then they will also be they will also clinch their spot in terms of making the playoffs, because they will be 6 points ahead of Chicago heading into the final day. So there's no doubt that New England are keeping an eye on the Chicago versus TFC game, and kind of keep an eye on the Orlando City versus FC Cincinnati game, because if both of those teams loses, then they don't have to really worry about anything heading into the final day of the season, as they of course will officially clinch their playoffs. And I'm pretty sure that they really hope that they can clinch their playoffs now, because on the final day of the season, they are going to be playing against Atlanta United on the road. And there is no doubt that, even though I said that Atlanta, there is still a lot of doubts of the fact that how would they actually look without Joseph Martinez in that starting 11. It's still a tough place to go to Mercedes-Benz Stadium, one of the toughest places to get points on the road, and able to win that game so that you can clinch your spot in the playoffs. So, but at the same time, it's not going to be easy when they have to face against the top team in the East, where, for NYCFC, they don't technically have to win this game. I mean, a draw in this game will be just enough for them to clinch their spot of the top seed in the Eastern Conference, and that they're going to get the first round bye in this. And that, if Philly does drop points against Columbus or lose that game against Columbus, then they, of course, will be clinched their position in terms of the top seed in the Eastern Conference, whether they win or lose. So, yeah, I think, certainly they still have something to play for, but they're definitely in a very good position of getting that top spot. And that I would go as far and say that I would be very surprised if NYCFC does not clinch this top spot. Like, if they do not clinch this top spot, I definitely have a little bit concern heading into the playoffs for them, considering the fact that they kind of go on a little bit of a cold streak, and that you definitely do not want to have a mini kind of cold streak heading into the playoffs. But finally, moving on into the final game of part 1 of this preview is the Atlantic Cup between the Red Bulls versus DC United. And that, while there has just been so many important games this week, I think if I had to pick a game that I think might be a very kind of sexy game, and a game that I could maybe even say that it's the game of the week, it has to be this one. Because, first of all, this is a rivalry game, and I know the Atlantic Cup, some people will say it's just getting old and that it's no longer a rivalry thing. No, it's a rivalry game. It's a historic rivalry. It's one of the earliest rivalry in MLS with the Red Bulls and DC United. You know, back in the early days, they really hate each other. And that in this game, not only the fact that they want to have some pride in terms of winning the Atlantic Cup, but there is also a lot of playoff implication in this game. And that the playoff implication in this game is going to be that last spot in the playoffs, where you can at least get a home game for the first round of the playoffs. And that, you know, both of these teams are only separated by a point. DC currently is in 4th place, while the Red Bulls is currently a point behind. And, you know, just to tell you guys what happened in the first Atlantic Cup, the Red Bulls was able to win the first one against DC United on the road, and they were able to pull out a 2-1 win out of Audi Field. And this is also the other thing that is also interesting about this game, is that both of these teams are actually red hot coming into this game. Like, the Red Bulls and DC, which it's hard to believe, but a couple of weeks ago, I think they were kind of really struggling in terms of them in their season, and that I even kind of question whether or not if the Red Bulls are even going to make it if they're continue the struggling run that they have. And the same can go with DC United. But now both of these teams have won 3 games on the trot, and those 3 games that both of these teams won in a row are against very tough opponent, and against teams that certainly are not like a cakewalk kind of game to win. This does make this game even more spicy, and that, I'll tell you what, I mean, if you look at this one, and that if one of these teams does get a win in this match, maybe they're going to clinch their spot in the 4th position. And that, you know, the reason why I say maybe is because if TFC does win against Chicago, then it could really come down to the final day of the season, where we're going to decide who exactly is going to get that elusive 4th spot, which is the last spot of potentially at least hosting 1 home games in the playoffs this season. But either way, guys, hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you do, make sure you guys leave a like, smash that subscribe button, and yeah, I of course will see you guys next time, and I will be doing the preview for the Western Conference kind of clash and the 7:30 p.m. Eastern Time, 4:30 p.m. Pacific Time kickoff game tomorrow.